Well, here we go. This is Life in the Peloton. I'm Mitch Docker, your host, and welcome everyone. The podcast is being brought to you by our major partner, MAAP. MAAP are one of the most innovative and influential brands in cycling apparel. And the best thing is, they started right out of here, my hometown, Melbourne. The podcast is also being brought to you by our good friends over at Bridge Road Brewers. Now, you may have seen it, or you may have even been lucky enough to try the Life in the Peloton's very own beer, which was made together with the Bridge Road Brewers. These guys know beer, but best of all, they love bikes too. And coming up in a couple of weeks, the 19th to the 21st of April, is the MAAP Beechworth Granite Classic, an unmissable gravel weekend. Friday night, they've got the shakeout ride, then with a few beers afterwards at the brewery, just as the hand-built bike show is kicking off inside the brewery as well. Then Saturday is the main event, the Granite Classic, a gravel ride through some amazing terrain, the best feed zone and entertainment en route that you can imagine, and the best part is it's a non-podium affair. Go as fast or as slow as you want, it's just about being out there for the day pedaling. Finish back in Beechworth to share a few stories and a cold beer of course or two around some fire pits. So good at this point post-ride. I love this moment. Saturday night though is the dinner for the Granite Legends, being hosted by none other than myself and Life in the Peloton, where we're going to explore this year what the hell is gravel, speaking with various guests to unpack this topic. Sunday morning, wake up and Specialized are gathering everyone together to do a gentle recovery ride. They've got all the bases covered up there. It's an awesome weekend, and if this is your first time thinking about doing an event like this, I highly recommend heading up to Beechworth. Good vibes and of course, great beer. Head across to beechworthgraniteclassic.com.au, check it out, read all about it, and sign up, and I'll see you up there. I'll be up there, of course, as well. Ketones. Now, why have I decided to explore this topic? Well, 60% of the Peloton are using them. And when I was racing, they were starting to filter in, and I experienced the effect that they had on the Peloton. Was it a placebo or was it actually working? I wasn't too sure. I was experiencing it myself because I was using them as a little bit as well. I was just feeling at the end of a Grand Tour, I was riding a little bit better. I was suddenly able to hang on a little bit longer on the big climbs. But was it the ketones or was it that I was actually just fitter that particular Grand Tour? I don't know. I guess what are ketones if you're sitting there wondering what the hell I'm talking about? Well, quite simply, they're a fuel source for the body. They occur naturally in the body to kick in when glycogen is not available, a backup source of fuel, either when food's not available or during a state of fasting, or it's when you've exercised for long periods of time and you've depleted all your glycogen stores. Your body naturally kicks into a state called ketogenesis, where it starts breaking down fat stores in the body and making them into a usable source of energy known as ketones. These types of ketones are endogenous ketones and are produced within the body. What we're exploring today is exogenous ketones, ketones produced outside the body. We're speaking with Michael Brandt, the CEO and founder of H.V.M.N, Health via Modern Nutrition, the world's first company to launch a drinkable ketone. Michael majored in computer science and product design at Stanford University, but he's also a really keen runner himself. He runs an incredible 2-hour 40 marathon, by the way. The use of exogenous ketones have taken over the Peloton, and we've seen a massive shift in racing the last few years. They're just going so bloody fast, and I wanted to understand what role ketones have played in this. In the second part of the episode, I thought it's going to be good to hear from a pro. We need to hear what these guys think of this. I'm speaking with New Zealand pro George Bennett, who's currently riding for Israel Premier Tech, to really understand what the riders think of exogenous ketone use in the Peloton. This is a really, really exciting topic. I've been using ketones in preparation for this podcast to again understand where the product has gone since I was using it back in 2019. A lot's changed. They're much more palatable now. And I think I actually feel the effect that we hear about today in the podcast, also in the brain. The cognitive effect, but also when I was out riding last week doing the Equinox ride, I was using ketones too. Sit back and enjoy this one, guys. Have a listen, understand what's going on, and maybe even give it a try yourself. Here we go. let's kick this off. Michael Brandt, really, really cool to have you on the podcast. I've got a lot that I want to ask you, and I think we can unpack what we're about to talk about today. Ketones, Ketones IQ, H.V.M.N, your company that are making these ketones. There's so much I want to unpack because, look, he takes a little sip of it. I love it. And that's the whole point, is because I was for a long time as an athlete trying to tap into the fat metabolization, like trying to fast myself, go out, train fasted to tap into this other source of energy, get ketones happening naturally and producing in my body. But then all of a sudden, this product there was this mystique around about this product sort of developing. I guess before we get into it, firstly, welcome to the podcast. I haven't even let you even say 2 seconds. Let's say hello first.
It's great to be here. Looking forward to a fun conversation today.
Secondly, great to have you on board. Let's go back, rewind, because myself included, and I think everyone out there wants to know what we're talking about when we say ketones, wants to know what I'm talking about when they say they're naturally produced in the body. And then what you're doing is sort of making these ketone esters that we're able to sort of drink and take in synthetically.
Yeah, it's a really exciting area. And a background on me is that I studied computer science in undergrad, big engineering background, and then got into endurance sports, running, triathlon, all that good stuff, and cycling and the whole lot, and started looking very closely at performance, as a lot of us do, right? We're it's very like quant oriented sport, because you can see your watts, you can see your FTP. I think that's part of the fun of the sport, is that there's really one goal, which is like go faster. And then inside of that, there's, dozens of little and big aspects that you can tweak on your nutrition, on your, the types of training that you do, all that fun stuff. And started looking at that. And then that personal passion for just myself as a hobbyist, in the sport, as well as the entrepreneurship drive, as well as just this engineering approach. I think it's a really interesting time where technology is better than ever. People are wearing wearables, and it's not just pros, and it's not just when you're on the bike. It's also when you're sleeping at night, and you can see your sleep scores and your recovery scores and your heart rate variability, and it's an exciting time.
The list goes on. Yeah.
And it can be overwhelming. Honestly, there's the idea of like data porn, where it's like too much data, or data for the sake of data. And like, what are we doing with all of it? What's actually useful here? And I, for myself, trying to make sense of that, and then trying to see, hey, what really moves the needle here? Like what should exist that doesn't exist already? And in 2019, I got a multi-million-dollar contract with the United States Department of Defense to develop and research the world's first ketone drink. And we'll go get in what all of that means. But the long and the short of it was that the United States military was interested in alternate sources of high performance energy. Besides, we all know about caffeine and other stimulants and that stuff. I'm not anti that stuff. I wouldn't say it just works to a degree. And at a certain point, it doesn't work anymore. It like interferes with your sleep and spikes your stress hormones and all that stuff. And in any event, there's just other ways to pull levers on our performance and get better output from our metabolism, our body's ability to make and use energy.
Is this something that the military always sort of, only being on the outside understanding this? It seems like, are these like the military always using them as guinea pigs to push the limits to get that extra performance? I feel like it starts there, it filters down to sports, professional sports, and then it filters down to the general public. Is that sort of how it works?
Well, it's interesting. I think in a lot of ways, the military has started to learn a lot from pro sports, where they've started to use the word athlete a lot, and the idea of training and recovery and just the holistic performance. I think if you rewind a couple of decades, there was this kind of like tough guy mentality of like, if you're a Navy SEAL or Green Beret, like you figure it out, or you're just like tough as nails. And like, there was a lot of the investment was into, better body armor and better guns and better radar and like the more hard tech. And then pro sports, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of crossover. Like a lot of ex-military guys go into being strength and conditioning coaches for pro sports teams and vice versa. There's a lot of like crossover because it is very elite level of performance. And what we've seen is just a lot more usage of the word athlete and like those types of protocols actually in the starting at the tip of the spear special forces and then trickling to the more general military of this idea of good nutrition, good sleep, and like preparing yourself so that when you are pushed to your limits, you're able to perform at your absolute peak, and then like ability to then like recover well from there and I think just seeing that, there's a lot of ways to improve outcomes for people after their time in the service. There's a lot of people are very burnt out. There's a lot of PTSD. There's high rates of suicidality. There's a lot of very dark side to what happens from people coming out of putting their life on the line in armed service. And so there's been, I think, a big eye opening over the last couple of decades towards, better nutrition and thinking about the human factor more holistically, and thinking about, and it's just interesting from my point of view, seeing more use of the word athlete in that context. So I would say it's fair to say that the learning goes both ways, that a lot of elite athlete protocols inform special operator protocols and vice versa. Yeah.
Yeah. It's gone are the days of, bread and water, and it's just a hard mentality of, whoever had the hardest mind and who was the hardest nut out there could get through it. It's well, actually we can tap into some of these, let's say, softer minds, but physique bodies. Let's build this actual machine up, this person, and then equip them with armor or whatever that's needed. It's sort of reverse roles. Let's rewind a bit then. How did you come into that?
I started looking at the literature and really looking at metabolism, how it works, and started playing around with these things like fat adaptation training and what does it mean to do a fasted workout. And that, when you don't have sugar available, blood glucose levels if your blood glucose levels are lower, your body is forced to tap into more fat metabolism, and you turn that fat into ketones, especially to keep your brain alive, that your brain can use glucose. Your brain cannot directly use fat. Fat doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So you need to turn fat into ketones. That's the whole concept of ketogenesis, of turn fat into usable energy. And the truth is we have those two fuel systems. We have our fat fuel system and we have our carbohydrate fuel system. And we can go more into what that all is. And what I started looking at was within human metabolism, and within training, we're trying to do different types of workouts. If you're doing a very sprinty workout, oftentimes you want to be fully loaded up, fully replete on your glycogen, so you can hit your intervals and hit them at max wattage, so that you're able to get the benefit there. You really show your legs how to go at a 10 out of 10 effort, and you need to be fully replete on your fuel sources for that. Versus if you're doing a longer, lower effort, and the goal being to get fat adapted, that you want to be able to tap your body's fat sources, which is a much, much larger source of slower burning, but larger source of energy. Then you do a lot of exercise, these lower intensities where you're getting more fat adapted. You're doing things like you're building more blood vessels to service your muscles. You're doing all these adaptations, even at a lower intensity, that help you to perform really well. Anyway, so as I started diving into this, the idea of ketones kept coming up. Is your body makes ketones if you don't have enough. As your blood glucose goes low, it's advantageous to do certain workouts in a fasted state to force that to happen. The word ketone kept coming up again and again. And then prodding at it, I was hey, well, there's clearly this advantage to getting your body to make and use its own ketones. What if on top of that you could also drink a ketone? This is a very interesting molecule that provides energy, and it doesn't require as much oxygen in order to turn into ATP, the fundamental energy currency of your cell. It doesn't require as much oxygen. So it's unequivocally good for your body to be adapted to be able to make and use its own. But what if you could also go and drink 10 grams of ketones on top? That seems very interesting. And
why do I have to go through this whole phase, this whole fasting phase to get this? What if I could just have it right now?
Yeah. And what if you did both, right? What if, right? What if you do all the best in class training, and then on race day, you have the ability to, you're drinking, X 100 grams of carbs every hour. And what if you can also have ketones on top, and it's going through this other pathway and conferring its own set of benefits, especially if you're metabolically flexible from your training, that it's an interesting additional fuel source that goes through that fat and ketone system. If we have these two systems, you have your glucose system that's very fast burning, very powerful, but limited in how much you can store. And when you're going at any kind of effort, you're going to be burning it faster than you can possibly be refilling it. So you're like a hybrid car almost, where you have gas and electricity, except that your carbohydrate system is very limited. You're going to run out, and your body's going to have to tap into your fat and ketone system. And so what's interesting, the whole premise of Ketone IQ as an exogenous ketone is that you're able to go through that fat and ketone pathway, but with something that's very quick, because normally that fat system, it's not as quick as glucose. That's why the glucose system is so powerful. Your fat system, it takes longer to turn fat into directly usable energy. So you have a lot of it, but generally is going to service you at like lower intensities because you can't draw on it as quickly. And so what's cool about Ketone IQ is that you're able to have something that works as quickly as glucose, but it goes through a different pathway. So it is not mediated by insulin. You don't need insulin to use it, which you need insulin for glucose. So it goes through this different set of reactions to turn into usable energy. And so it's all to say that if you stack it, like if you're used to whatever amount of carbohydrates, and then you're also stacking ketones on top, it allows you to have more substrate available for your muscles to turn into energy. And especially your brain just really likes ketones. And when you're kind of in that, we all know that feeling, being kind of blurry, or like just really when you're really in the hole for a while. And a lot of times it's not that your legs are actually completely diminished. It's that you run out of, like, your brain has run out of electricity. Like your brain can't tell your legs to shut up and go.
To function.
Yeah. Anyway, I know I've said a lot. I'm obviously very passionate about the topic. I said a lot. Let me pause there.
Let me break down a couple of things. And a real simple things is, firstly, ketones as a source of energy. Help me understand what using ketones as a source of energy when you're exercising, what the difference is between ketones and glucose. Explain the two differences. And, is there any difference when you're fueling yourself out there? Like, what is the difference when you're out there riding or running or whatever it is? Is it ketones actually a better source of energy, or is this a different source that actually has no difference in the feeling of your performance?
That's a great question. And when we say ketones have energy in it, it means literally there's calories inside of it. So if you have 10 grams of ketone IQ, it's 70 calories. And it's the same way that goo or a Morton or carbohydrate powder, like there's calories per every gram of carbohydrate. And ketones, so to be very clear, caffeine doesn't have calories. It's acaloric. It's a stimulant. Caffeine is interacting with hormone receptors that make you perceive to be more alert, and it's effective to that end, but it's acaloric. So when we're talking about things with calories, you have, sugar has calories in it. Ketones are very interesting that it has calories in it, and it's providing those calories via a different source than sugar. As far as how it feels or where it's good, it's really good for those longer efforts. So like if someone's, sprinting all out for 20 minutes, if you're doing like a 20-minute FTP test, that's going to be very glycolytic. It's going to be very blood sugar oriented. Like you got to go. As you're going to like the 1 hour, 2+ hour, as you're going to these longer efforts where you're not at that max output, like you just can't hold max for 2 hours, say, when you're at these sub-maximal efforts, that's where ketones tend to really shine as what they are is very efficient. It's a very efficient form of fuel. Glucose always is going to give you that like ultimate like pop. What's really interesting, what we've seen with ketones is that they're actually able to preserve your glycogen. So if you're riding for 2 hours and you have elevated ketones because you've been drinking ketones, you basically are protecting your glycogen, so you have more matches to burn. Because when it's time to burn a match, right, or when it's trying to really sprint, that's going to be very glycolytic. That's going to be all out effort, and you're really going to need glucose for that. And it's neat then when you're riding at, if you're cruising along at 80% effort, if you're able to protect your glycogen and you're able to run on ketones, then that starts being really interesting. You're basically able to save more matches. So I hope, does that clarify? It's not like this sprinty, like go fuel, but it's this very efficient, longer drive fuel that then protects your glycogen for when you do need to sprint.
So maybe it's sort of like you've got your rocket fuel and you've got your diesel fuel, something that just sort of chugs you along when you're just at a steady state. And I guess the question I want to ask now is, let's move into the World Tour Peloton. I've heard this quote around, 60 to 70% of the pro Peloton are tapping into these exogenous ketones now. I guess let's talk about the classics. They're on right now. The Belgian classics, it's a long race, 6 hours. So what you're explaining there, for help me and everyone else understand, is that when you're rolling along, when these guys are rolling, and I use that in inverted commas, when they're sort of racing at a steady state and they reach these climbs, they sprint over these climbs and they drop back down into a steady state again, they're able to sort of mix between those two fuel sources. Is that how it sort of works? So you come into, say, the Quaremont, and these guys hitting in there, they're rolling in at a steady state, and suddenly they hit the Quaremont, they peak up, they need that rocket fuel, so they tap into the glucose, but as they get over the top, they're able able to recover, and then they're getting a bit of a mix of ketone fuel and glucose fuel. Can you actually mix the two? Is it work as simple as that?
Yeah, it works as simple as that. And even prior to exogenous ketones and ketones drinks like that's just the way that human physiology works, is that the truth is you're always burning a mix. And it depends on the level of intensity. And at the higher intensities, if you imagine like a pie chart of what you're drawing upon, that at the higher intensities, the largest piece of the pie is glucose. And at the lower intensities, the largest piece of the pie will be your fat ketone system. And that when you then have a ketone drink in the mix, it's just adding to the availability, the bioavailability inside of that fat ketone system.
So when you're training and you're doing this fat metabolization and you're getting better at metabolizing fat for energy, this was something that I was doing in the off season, training fasted, this sort of thing, because before sort of these ketones were available, we're trying to tap into that. We're trying to push the limits of what our our steady state training was, and trying to tap into using natural occurring ketones within the body. Then when we were able to use a bit of combination of both, but now we're able to get it externally, synthetically. So being more trained, fat adapted, and having a higher sort of low steady rate, is that better then now? Because we can use a lot more. I guess what I'm trying to say here is these athletes, their ability to drop back down and use ketones for energy is much higher because they've been training it for a longer time, opposed to someone who's only used carbohydrates, who's only used glucose as their fuel source. They may be using a tiny bit of ketones for energy, but you can actually increase that, can you?
Yes, that's a big part of what happens inside of metabolic flexibility. When we think about that adaptation that occurs when you're doing those lower intensity rides, when you're doing those in a fasted state, that your body is literally making more enzymes to be able to metabolize ketones. And then you have more of those available. So this idea of metabolic flexibility is very real. And when you're constantly fueling with carbohydrate, you will have more pop, but you won't be developing that flexibility. And so that's why it's both. And I would say the state of the art on training is that people will have more fueling before sessions that require more pop, because when you're doing like a sprint session, interval session, like you really want to be able to go max out, because you want to really train your muscles at that max load. That like the higher the max load that your muscles can push, then that correlates to how strong you'll be over longer efforts. Like there's a certain training benefit that you get from intervals and sprints, and you want to be able to go all out for those. At the same time, like the next day, you might do a longer session where the express goal of that training session is to tap into more metabolic flexibility and be able to raise your kind of baseline. Like how much can I do while keeping my heart rate low? How many watts can I push without it feeling high strain and, staying inside of a zone 2? And all that stuff is going to increase your metabolic flexibility and your body's ability to tap into fat and ketones. And then in a race, it's a mix, right? Like the more that you have of both, the more top end that you have, that's great. And then the more of that kind of like low medium gear that you have, that's great as well. You're just going to be more efficient across both.
So as you become more efficient, essentially, you're using still that mix, or even let's look at the balance of it. You might be using a higher percentage of ketones, when you're at say like 20, 30% of your max. And as you get fitter and fitter, you're able to keep using ketones longer before you're having to tap into using the glucose. And ultimately, I guess the biggest benefit here is that you're saving those glucose in the muscle for when you need it for the big punches, to follow those accelerations, to follow the final attack at the end of the race. And I guess what we've seen and what I've noticed I'm only assuming this, you can tell me yes or no. What I've noticed is over the period, I guess back in 2019, 2020, when I was still racing and I did notice them coming into the Peloton, I was like, what's going on here? Why are these guys riding away from us? This is ridiculous. What is this new thing, this ketones? It was just simply that they had more energy source left at the end of the race.
It's super interesting. It's this very unique molecule that people now have access to that it's different from, I think, what some people may expect, where with caffeine or with goo or just different carbohydrate gel packs, that it's this very like spiky kind of energy. what's interesting about ketones is it's like this slow burn. And so sometimes when people have it the first time, it doesn't necessarily punch you in the face, but what it does is that an hour into your ride, you're like not as drained as you should be. And you feel like you can punch harder. And so it's this very interesting effect that you have where, yeah, you're not like, just like, you know, we all know that feeling of having too much caffeine and you're kind of like jumping out of your shoes and you just need to like punch a hole in the wall. It's less of that feeling and more of this like longer, slower burn. It's like the embers of a fire. You know how sometimes like embers of the fire last way like hours, but sometimes there's still be embers at the campfire like the next morning. It's like it's still burning, like the kind of core of it is still burning like much longer than you would maybe think it should. It's been really interesting on the sport, and I think there's some controversy around it. I'm here for the controversy in the sense that I think that the sport evolves. I mean, I'm curious your thoughts on it, because like there's certain evolutions of the sport that are good, right? We all saw the like Team Visma. We do a lot of work with Team Visma. We saw their new like helmets, right? Their new Tron style helmets that look like they're blasting off to Mars. We see different materials on the fabrics on the suits. We see, you know, even aero bars where, I mean, that's come up in my lifetime. We see electric shifters, right? We see like advances in the sport that are like good for the sport. We also see people taking advantage of the sport, doing things that they shouldn't, or that are fundamentally bad for the sport. It's definitely, you know, every team, every rider's like pushing the limits in their own way. And I'm curious your thoughts on it. I think that where a line gets drawn is, are you doing something that involves like a trade-off of like, if we're all injecting pig's blood into our arms to get higher, you know, oxygen carry, then, and that is making like half the people die of a heart attack at age 45. Like, okay, that's bad for the sport, right? Because then people have to think about, okay, if I want to win the race, I got to do something that's going to decrease from my longevity. Whereas like a more aerodynamic speed suit or something, it's like, there's no downside to it. There's no like, no one's going to die sooner from it. So that's where I draw the line.
Unless they're going too fast. Yeah. Unless the suit's ridiculously fast. Yeah.
And then you're just, yeah. I think I'm curious your thoughts on just like advance of the sport. Like there's certain things that are good for like move the sport forward, and there's certain things that don't.
I think for me, in the very beginning, it seemed a bit taboo. It was so, and that's something I want to ask you too, is it came in and it was this secret thing and no one was talking about it. You know, everyone was using it, but no one was talking about it. And we're even told not to talk about it. So it sort of had this feeling like, what am I doing? Is this thing legal? It is a naturally occurring substance in the body. And what you've been able to do is harness that and supply it to the body without having to go into the state of ketosis. The point is, once I started to understand the science behind it, it very quickly in my mind became different to sort of performance enhancing drugs or even a stimulus like a caffeine, because it was just something that was, another energy source. Yet the benefit from it again keeps making me feel like, wow, how could it be so good this? How could I feel so good from just like an extra energy source? We've actually seen this happen with correct fueling these days. When I first moved into the Peloton, there was no real talk about proper fueling. Then we dropped into this whole low carb, trying to tap into this fat metabolization, where I was actually well and truly under fueling in a lot of races, trying to go, I need to get into ketosis, not even having any carbs, and just racing on this and feeling the effects days and days after. Suddenly when we started to fuel properly just with carbohydrates, our performances, what we've seen in the Peloton, have increased. The speeds are going faster. Now adding ketones as well to add an extra source of energy, things have really accelerated. So I think there was a little bit of a funny view about it, but as people are starting, and that's what the point of this podcast is to just sort of break down this myth around it, this sort of fog around what this substance is, what this product is more. It's probably a better word for it, because all it is just simply aiding to what we already have. I want to ask you, just on the back of that, what was your feeling starting to work with these teams around the 2020, 2019, when it was a little bit sort of misunderstood? The product was slightly different then. It tasted like absolute crap. It made it feel like it was super bad, for you. What is the vision of this, and why are organizations like the UCI trying to find a way to rule it out?
It's been an interesting topic where, the early days, people didn't want to talk about it because it's an edge and people don't want the next team over to know about it or how they're using it. And understandable, like if you have a new training methodology or if you have new technology in some way that you don't want to spread the word, you want to keep that as your competitive advantage. And it's interesting from our point of view because we're trying to not keep it a secret. We're trying to grow the business.
Sell it, get it out there. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And so it's always an interesting tension there. But it's all in good fun, because I think that, like, ultimately it's going to be everywhere. Where, Gatorade got started in the 1960s with the Florida Gators in the States, and Florida, for those who know, is very humid, very swampy, and you sweat a lot. American football game there. And so it was a good context to introduce electrolytes. And it was similar growth curve to it. It was, it took 3 decades before they had Michael Jordan like sweating colored, blue sweat, Gatorade sweat. And it was becoming a mainstream idea. So in a sense, I'm not worried about just the longer term. I think ketones are here to stay and will be a major macronutrient source for sport, for not sport, for people just, at their desk wanting to get into a good mental state while they're, on a podcast, or while they're jamming on spreadsheets or doing their work. Like, we have a lot of doctors who work long shifts who don't want to be slamming caffeine all day, who will have ketone IQ. So I think it's here to stay in that sense. I think it's been interesting this year, especially where, so we've been working with a lot of the teams for a number of years, and, using discretion. And if people don't want us talking about it too much, we just use broader numbers of like, hey, like X% of the Peloton is using it, but we don't name names or don't point people out, just using our discretion on it. And then this year we started just officially partnering with Team Visma in a public way, where we are working with them on there's really 2 parts to the partnership. One is we're doing added research around ketones. So we're working with them, and in collaboration with KU Leuven in Belgium. They're one of the leading research institutions on just like sports physiology in general. They've produced a ton of super interesting papers. The lab there by Heel Poff is the lead investigator there. Just ton of great materials coming out of there. So we're working with them on added research studies. Actually, we can go into this a little bit, but that there's some promise on ketones help your body's natural production of EPO, which is obviously super interesting. Anyway, so the whole prong of research there. And then the second is working with Team Visma Lease A Bike on just education. Like, I think it's cool to hear how they incorporate it here. I think people just, the trust of someone on camera say, hey, yeah, I'm in the Bumblebee yellow jersey and talking about it, holding the product, I think just adds a level of trust. And so that's been a big, I would say, advancement in the sport in just the last, since we kicked that off earlier this year. It's March right now. We kicked that off in January, where it's kind of like lifting the veil in a lot of ways, where it's not this like hush hush, like, oops, like 60% of the Peloton is using it, but can't say who. And I think just at a point where so many people are talking about it and using it, and it's like, okay, let's talk about it in an educated and informed way. I think it's going to be very tough. I mean, I don't want to be flippant on it. I think that there's real like, ongoing conversation of like, there are people who have like a lot of questions about it. I think it's a lot of hot air as far as people who want to not be allowed in the sport, because your body produces ketones. If you go and take a blood prick on Seb Kuss at the end of a stage race, like, he's going to have elevated ketones regardless. Like, your body, your metabolism just kicking in, everything we've been talking about, your body's started to mobilize onboard fat and turn it into ketones. You're going to have elevated ketones, and you can't really pinpoint if that person drank a ketone or if their body's making it or not making it. So I think the fact that your body naturally produces it, and also the key thing too, like we were saying earlier, that there's not a trade-off. You're not doing a deal with the devil. Like, I'm all for rider health. Like, this is actually just like a healthy way to fuel. It helps people recover better. It helps with sleep quality. It helps accelerate recovery. It helps people be mentally more sharp. And if that can avoid one accident on the Peloton, that's a win for us. Like, people are just more dialed in and alert. So I'm all for rider health. If there's some crazy stimulant, again, we're injecting pig's blood and it's going to clog your arteries and you're going to have a chance you pass out of a heart attack, right? There was all these stories from like a couple decades back of people having to like get up in the middle of the night because they were blood doping to get their red blood cell count up. And then you have to wake up in the middle of the night and like ride on the bike for 20 minutes.
To keep things moving.
Yeah, basically, yeah. You had so many red blood cells that if you didn't keep things moving, that you might clot an artery. So you had to wake up in the middle of the night and get a pump going. I'm not for that. I think that is bad. I think it's bad for the sport when people have to do something that's going to have a deleterious effect. I think what's plus for the sport is when is just better rider health. If people can be sharper, more fueled, better dialed in, and it's all in a positive way, I think that's actually a win for the sport. So people are obviously entitled to all have their own different opinions, and controversy around to an extent is good if people like chatting about ketones, but I'm very much obviously pro on it. And look, I think before jumping into ketones, obviously I'm going to be pro. I run a company and our main thing is Ketone IQ, but I will say that like prior to jumping into ketones. Like there's a lot of other things I could be working on. Like I wasn't like, it's not like my dad worked on ketones and I inherited the business and I'm kind of stuck to it. Like I could be working on 20 different things. I think that it was fundamentally interesting. Ketones are fundamentally interesting to me, of all the different levers to pull and human performance. And
well, let's break down a couple of those performance sort of, I guess, positive performance attributes coming out of ketones. We've spoken about the fuel source, but it doesn't just really end there. We've spoken about loosely about the brain, what it does for that. It's a natural fuel source for the brain. I don't really understand what exactly that means, why it's better. You know, you spoke about brain fog. Of course, we want to have on the bike when you're at the end of the race, your decision making is, you know, a little bit inhibited because you're just tired. You didn't really know why. But off the bike, when you're sitting at the desk, everyone in their normal life, tell me a little bit about the positive effects that ketones have, not only just for that fuel source, but where else? You know, recovery you spoke about as well.
Yeah. Your body's constantly doing metabolism, and metabolism is the process of creating energy, creating usable energy for your cells. And you're constantly doing that. You're doing that when you're riding hard on the bike, and you're doing that when you're recovering and you're repairing your muscles and recovering. You're doing that when you're sleeping. You're doing it when you're sitting at your desk going through spreadsheets or emails. Your body's always doing metabolism. You're always using energy. It's similar to, in a way, like water, right? You're always using water. You're using water at 10 a.m. You're using it at 10 p.m. It's just this kind of nutritional primitive that your body's always using. If it's 10 a.m. and you're dehydrated, you're going to feel a little bit slow, and you drink some water, you'll feel better. If it's 10 p.m. and you're dehydrated, you might be restless and have a hard time falling asleep. And so the point being with water is that you can drink it kind of any time in the day. And if you're dehydrated, it's going to help you do what your body needs to do at that point in your circadian rhythm better. And we can look at fueling the same way. And what's interesting about ketones is, it has these performance benefits while you're on the bike. And then off the bike, it also helps accelerate recovery. It helps with muscle protein resynthesis. It helps with muscle glycogen reuptake. So it's helping your body to recover better. That's actually one of the areas where, I mean, as you know, like a lot of the Grand Tour races are strenuous to say the least, right? We're biking for 21 out of 23 days. It's just every single day. And so if you can get some kind of jump on recovery, that's obviously a huge win. If you can like recover more quickly as soon as today is over, it's actually like, how quickly can I recover into the start line tomorrow?
Is that what I was feeling? Like a couple of years ago, I was using it in the Grand Tour, and I got to the end of the Grand Tour, and this is the best way I explain it to people. It's like, well, what's it like using ketones? I said, well, I didn't do any better numbers than I ever had. The difference was at the end of the Grand Tour, I was still doing the same sort of numbers I did at the start. And then that meant I was riding 2 or 3 groups more forward than I was at the start. So for instance, I'm a bigger guy, so I'd normally get dropped in the first group. At the end of the Grand Tour, I was suddenly like, there's 60, 70 guys dropped already. I'm like, what's going on here? That's super weird. So I'd look at my numbers. I'm like, I'm still pushing like 400 watts up the first 20-minute climb. That's not really much more than I normally do. So I wasn't actually performance enhanced, but I was actually less fatigued. Was it because I was better fueled throughout the whole tour, saving more glycogen, or was it because I was having that better recovery? What was it?
Yeah, it's the lack of decrement is a really interesting effect. There was a study out of that same group in Belgium where they took exogenous ketones, and they had riders. They had 2 groups of riders, both training at a high level over 3 weeks, and one group was having ketones 3 times a day, and the other was not having ketones. They were having a placebo. So neither group, it was blinded. Neither group knew what they were having. And aside from that, the training protocols were the same. They were both allowed to eat ad libitum, meaning as much as they would like, the same diets. And then at the end of 3 weeks, they showed that the ketone group was outputting at 15% higher power on the final time trial relative to the placebo group. So I mean,
15%.
Yeah, it's wild, right? It's like this ability to recover faster. Basically, your body is doing a lot of complex processes in recovery in order to get ready for the next day. And so if you can get a jump on that, if you can recover better, if you have less metabolic stress, less inflammation, faster protein resynthesis, faster glycogen reuptake. All that stuff helps you dial in better for the next day.
So 15% higher than the other group, not 15% better than their original performance.
Right. Well, yeah, as you'd expect, at the end of the 3 weeks, like everyone's kind of diminished, or like at the best, they're maybe like holding flat. But that the group that didn't have ketones was more diminished.
Yeah, exactly. So exactly what I was feeling in the Grand Tour.
Yeah.
So I wasn't having a raised performance. I was just sort of staying around the same and everyone else was getting less.
Yeah. And then on another interesting benefit is just the kind of the day-to-day use, where I know a lot of people are 99% of people with the bike don't have the good fortune of being able to be a professional rider like yourself and be able to get after it full time for a living. And it's like, as soon as your training session ends, you're,
back into it.
Yeah. Superman.
Normal life. Yeah.
Superman goes back to Clark Kent, and you gotta take off the spandex and go to the office. And in that world, we see a lot of people having ketone IQ for normal performance at work. Like, it is, your brain especially likes ketones because, again, like the whole reason that we evolved the ability to make and use ketones over 300,000 years human evolution is the fact that your brain can't use fat. Your blood-brain barrier is very selective on what it lets in. Fat can't get in, but ketones can, glucose can. And so when you're low blood glucose, which is like pretty common, and especially in an ancestral, like on the savannah, you don't have constant access to carbohydrates. If you're going a day or two without a meal or without a carbohydrate meal, or you're walking around 10 miles a day, like you're often in this state where you have low glucose and your brain needs to perform. Humans especially have a large brain mass for our body, the largest in fact ratio. And so it's all to say that your brain really likes ketones when they're available, and ketones are this very special brain fuel. And truth be told, a lot of what people like, just observe about ketones when they are enjoying it, is that they feel it mentally. It's like, yeah, it's true that your calf and your quad and stuff can fuel on ketones, but what people tend to notice is that they're just a little bit brighter than they would otherwise be, whether they're on the bike or, again, like at the office or long shift at the hospital as a doctor. Like, people are able to be more dialed in mentally for longer. And I'm not trying to like take away anyone's coffee. I still have my cup of Joe every morning. Like, it's not like an anti-caffeine thing. It's more of just like a different option, because I think a lot of people at a certain point don't want to just keep sipping coffee because it interferes with your sleep.
Is it more of like a feeling like a steady state sort of energy? You're sort of not getting this massive high, but you're not getting this low. It's just like, I can just keep trucking, whether you're sitting at the desk. And I want to speak to you about another thing, is that you're a pretty handy runner. I checked that out. You're doing, well, I want to say sub 3 hours, but you're at the lower end of well and truly under sub 3. It's not even like you did, I did 2:58, sub 3. You're a very fast runner. So you've been tapping into it in different forms. And that's what I want to sort of get into, one day versus a grand tour. We spoke about grand tours, and we're talking about the classics now that are on right now. Visma Lease A Bike, they'll be out there. And a lot of teams will be using it for fuel in a one-day race. As we spoke about earlier, being able to use and save this glucose for the end of the race, for those punches. When you're doing a pretty steady state effort, like a marathon, you're not really going up and down climbs and the heart rate's not peaking highly and then you're recovering down a descent. It's sort of hovering around, I guess probably around threshold for you when you're running that quick. You're really just hovering at a heart rate for 2.5 hours, 3 hours, a pretty hardcore sort of pace. I would think that, you're tapping into quite a lot of glucose in that state in a one day. Where's the benefit there when you're having ketone IQ? Is it just that little mix that you get there? How does it work when you're just doing a one-time all-out sort of effort like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because, when you're at that best marathons at 2:40, so around 6 minutes per mile, little around 4 minutes a kilometer.
It's sub 4. I checked it out. It was like 3:45. Ridiculous.
Yeah. And you're close to full stick, but you're absolutely right. You're basically holding right under your line for a really long period of time. And the goal is not to fluctuate, because if you go above your line, you get way less efficient. If you go below your line, then you're just not going fast enough. And if you want to hit your time, then later in the race, you're going to have to go above your line, and it's not going to be fun. In a way, it's like, maybe a cycling analogy would be just like you're in a velodrome or something with very controlled circumstances. You're just going really flat and like right at or under your red line for an extended period of time. And then, so in that case, you're burning, the truth is at that point, you're burning just a mix of carbohydrate and ketone. You're burning, once you start going above your red line, that's where you get really glycolytic and you're really going to run out of fuel very quickly. But what part of what defines that line that you can hold is the ability, is that spot where you can cruise for 2.5, 3 hours, a long period of time, no matter how you cut it. Like even if you're a fast marathoner, like you're still out there for hours, and you're going to be using a mix of glycogen and fat and ketones. And so the way that our pro marathon partners use it, and the way I use it is you end up stacking. What ends up happening is you have, for every 2 or 3 carb gels, you have a ketone shot, and it's that blend. It's the idea of dual fueling. Again, it's that pie chart where you're drawing on both forms of energy, and having more availability of both is going to help you have a better day out there. And then, we very much recommend stacking both. Like, there's no world where I don't recommend, unless you have very specific reason for really wanting to do this. Like, I don't recommend anyone like swap to ketone IQ from carbohydrate. That's not the move.
It's the combo, isn't it?
It's the combo. It's the ability to dual fuel. It's the ability to run like a Prius. Like, you have gas and you have electricity at the same time.
It was really interesting. The other day, I received a sample from you guys just to test it out. Been a long time since I'd used ketones, and look, they used to. A couple of questions out of this is, I'd like to know how they've changed over the years since 2019, 2020. The flavor was substantially horrible compared to the other day. I did this long ride. It was a Equinox ride, riding for 12 hours. So I thought, I'm going to give this ketone IQ a go. And I dosed it every 2 hours. It seemed ridiculous because back then they were much more expensive, and the teams were only giving us, 2 or 3 a day because it was just more a financial thing. So we'd have one before the stage, one during, and one after. Now I was just pumping into for, 6, 7 for that day. And I was like, geez, this is ridiculous. So at a price point, they're much more affordable now. On a taste side of things, they're much more, you can drink them pretty easily now. I'd like to know what's changed over the last few years to, 1, bring the price down, 2, to make the taste better. But 3, on that fueling side of thing or dosing side of thing, it is quite often, it isn't, you can, and what happens when you have too much? Is that negative? Can you overdose?
Yeah, that you can have too much of a good thing for sure. Like, you can have too much caffeine, you can have too much water, you have too much ketones, and that you don't want to over spike on your ketones by having way too much at a time, because there end up being performance drawbacks, just period. Like, just like anything. Again, the same, you wouldn't want to have too much caffeine, or you can overdo it on water. Okay, so it's been a really interesting timeline. Let me kind of lay it out here, where in 2019, we were the first ever ketone ester in the world. And what an ester is a simple chemical bond. So an ester is a chemical bond. And what we were esterifying together was 2 similar but different ketone molecules. One is a ketone acid, and one is what's called a ketone diol. And so it's 50-50. And what we were seeing was that the acid component is very spiky. So it's very quick. It very quickly spikes and dissipates your ketone levels. And it also tastes crazy. It was part of what contributed to this just very acrid taste of things. And then the esterification process itself also very expensive, because you're taking these 2 molecules and you're kind of duct taping them together. And in part with our work with the DoD and working with other elite athletes, what we realized was that the diol component is superior. It's much lower on cost, and it's much more palatable, to where we're able to, if we stopped esterifying and just focused on just the diol, we were able to get the cost per effective gram of ketones down significantly. And then instead of having to, what we were doing when we had the ester version was we were basically titrating it out. We were saying, hey, have a small amount every so often, partly because it's very expensive, but partly because it's very spiky. So in order to manage the spike and dissipate, we would say just sip on it, on a, every 20 minutes, have a little bit of it. The diol itself, it delivers ketones, but on a more longer curve. So you get the same area under the curve, but longer time horizon. And so when you ask what's changed since 2019 is that instead of using this ester of ketone diol and ketone acid, we focus just on the diol as a superior technology. So what we have right now, Ketone IQ, just to be super clear on it, is a ketone diol. And so we were the first ever to bring a ketone ester to market. And then we updated our technology to just pure ketone diol. And we've made some advances inside of there where we've made it, we ferment it. So it comes from, basically you take specialized bacteria and you feed them plant stock, plant material, and then they ferment out the ketone molecule. So it's basically like a kombucha factory where the end product is this ketone diol. And that's given us three things. It's given us one, just better performance profile. We like that extended curve where if you're over spiking your ketones, you have performance drawbacks where ketones are slightly acidic. And so if you're spiking your ketone levels like too high too quickly, the same way that like too much blood lactate, like you get that kind of like acid burn feel to it. You don't want to be too high on blood acid. You want a little bit of ketones, too much, and then it dissipates quickly, not good. Okay, so what we like about the ketone diol is three things. One is that it has a better just performance curve to it. We like that it brought the cost per gram of ketones down significantly. And then thirdly, the taste, GI, like it's just no fun. Like if drinking something is going to make you heave, or like 1 in 5 people just can't even keep it down, then that's like, it's not even that helpful anyway. And truth be told, we're still innovating on, what's next. That very much my whole mission is making ketones universally accessible and just continuing to develop the delivery technology, make it taste better, just get it in the hands of more people and more use cases and more effective to the job at hand. And so we're continue to develop it. I'm not like dogmatically, ideologically married to like any specific magical formula right now today. Like it's very much like the iPhone 2 was better than the iPhone 1, the iPhone 3 even better. That it's our job to continue innovating in this space. And we see how like carbohydrates have evolved from like very simple gels back in the day to now it's like this mix of glucose and fructose and maltodextrose, and the science of carbohydrate delivery has come a long way. I think we're still early. We're out ahead as far as just being the first to do it and then continuing to innovate on it and continuing to innovate out ahead on ketone delivery. So a lot in the research pipeline, like the R&D pipeline to come as well.
Is there any sort of long-term sort of studies or effects you can see coming from overuse of this sort of synthetic ketones? I think, is there a way that the body will stop naturally producing it itself, because you're having it from another source? It doesn't go, wow, I'm going to switch that off. I'm getting it, through this synthetic way. I don't know. Is there, what are, I guess, the long-term sort of things that people are trying to poke holes in, and the UCI and other, I guess, sporting bodies trying to go, well, we don't know what is going to be the long-term effect. And I know a lot of riders are talking about that, going, look, this hasn't been tested for a long time. It may give us a boost right now, but what's going to happen in 10 years' time if I take this heavily for 5 years?
I think it's a very fair question. What I can say to that is that ketones, like our body knows what to do with ketones. We metabolize them. Like when they're present in our system, we turn them into ATP for our cells. It doesn't interfere with your body's ability to make its own ketones. Like your body is still going to make ketones. There's no feedback loop where drinking a ketone like stops your body from making ketones. Like I will say like anything you eat is stopping your body from making ketones, in the sense that you make ketones generally when you're starving. Like generally when you're low on nutrition is when your body will make its own ketones. So if you eat a bagel, your body's going to put a temporary pause on making ketones, but your body is really good at making and using ketones. We give you ketones in a bottle, and then your body knows how to metabolize them. So I feel good on the fundamentals of, it's a metabolite that your body is well equipped to know how to use. This isn't some like complicated, just weird hormone disruptor. With ketones, we just see that it's a metabolite, a substrate that your body can use and does already anyway. And what we're doing isn't this like super complicated interference. It's just a new fuel that your body is able to use. Yeah.
Stepping away from, I guess, elite performance, and, a big reason why we want to drop into sort of ketosis and burn a lot of fat is that, you start to, you mentioned it then, is to lose weight. And that's a great way to sort of, to burn fat, is to go into this state and, not have just sort of using glucose or carbs for energy. And that way you're going to start to burn some of that little bit of puppy fat off. Tell me about ketones and how taking these may interfere with that. Is that going to, stop that process, or is it going to aid that process? If you're going there and you're not then having to convert fat to get ketones to get energy, you're just getting it through using, ketone IQ, is that going to be a positive or negative effect there?
Yeah. And I like the puppy fat. And I haven't heard that before. Well, I've had people say baby fat, but I like puppy fat. One of the characteristics of ketones, and people can decide for themselves whether this is a plus or a minus, I think it depends on the person, is that we've seen that drinking ketones has a appetite suppressing effect, where there's a study where 2 participant groups were given, one was given ketones, one was given placebo, and at the ketone group, they reported lower subjective hunger rates, like higher satiety. They just didn't feel as hungry. And then when they measured bloods and they looked at ghrelin, one of the indicators of hunger, one of the hunger hormones, that people had less ghrelin levels. And let me also mention, in the placebo group, that people were given the same amount of calories just from sugar. So if you're given, say, 100 calories of ketones versus 100 calories from sugar, the ketone group felt more satiated after some amount of hours. And then they also had less of the hunger hormone ghrelin. And so that's interesting. And the reason I say that can be a plus, can be a minus, is that can be a plus if you see appetite suppression as a good thing. I would say, like, for a lot of endurance athletes, a lot of times our issue is like, we're not eating enough. Like, we need to eat 3,000 calories a day, and we need to make sure to keep up with performance. But then I would say a lot of athletes are trying to lean down, and a lot of less serious athletes, a lot of people, I mean, we know, like, a lot of people, the reason that I would say a more normal person goes to the gym is they're trying to lose the puppy fat. They're trying to they're trying to lean out and bulk up, and that the idea of having less hunger cravings is really attractive. I would just say that for someone who's really pushing it, so someone who's getting like 7+ workouts in a week, that, like, putting ketones aside, I think one of the easiest ways for an endurance athlete to do better is just literally eat more. Like, I think so many of us, like, we're so busy training itself can counterintuitively be kind of an appetite suppressant. Like, you're not hungry right after you get off the bike. Like, I think sometimes it can be hard to actually get an honest enough amount of calories. And I've just seen it myself. Like, whenever I'm on the fence about, should I eat or not? I don't really feel hungry, but, like, I should eat. Like, and then I eat. I always feel better when I, like, eat more.
Well, it makes sense now to me, pretty obviously, that, around performance, you want to be refueling for the next day, for the next effort, next training session, next race, whatever it is. But when you've got those periods of time where you are cool, I know that myself, okay, off season or a week off or post a race, I want to try and slim down. I want to try and take advantage of this time when I don't need to perform the next day. Yep. I can go into the next session feeling a little bit underfueled. Having these exogenous ketones at a time when you're trying to fast and go long without a meal can aid that, can help that, because you're not going to get those cravings. You're going to have that usable source of ketones there to sort of help aid that, I guess, fat loss in a way, dropping into that next sort of phase of burning fat. It can get hard in those moments when you're trying to sort of fast and go long term. Have you used it in a long period of fasting yourself?
I consider it to be like aided fasting, where you're not having anything with carbohydrates in it, which spikes your blood insulin. And I consider it fasting compliant. I mean, a very true fast is like 0 calories in, and like, you can have water. Debatable if like caffeine's acceptable, but basically you're supposed to, a true fast is like acaloric. I'd consider ketones to be fasting compliant in the sense that they're not carbohydrates. A lot of what people are going after with a fast is to increase their insulin sensitivity, and you do that by not having carbohydrates. When you eat carbohydrates, your blood sugar goes up, and then your blood insulin goes up to match that blood sugar. So a lot of people, the reason why people are fasting is to develop more insulin sensitivity, and then in general to lean out. It's just that equation of calories in, calories out. What's interesting about that is that there's certain calories that are just much more satiating. Like, if you have 500 calories, there's a way to do that will just blow through you, and you'll be hungry again in an hour. And then there's a way to do that is going to satiate you a lot better. So when people are in that kind of lean out period where they're okay with some decrement in performance, but they're really trying to hit weight. And we see this a lot with like wrestlers and combat sports in general. You see it with weightlifting, like especially in those sports where there's like strict weight classes. And then you see it also in cycling, because we're all after the like watts per kilogram, that if you're in that mode of being okay with some performance decrement and you're trying to lean out, then it starts becoming really interesting. Like, okay, you can either all out fast, have 0 calories, or you can be selective about, okay, I'm going to have some calories, but I want those calories to be very satiating or appetite suppressing. And it's not just ketone IQ there. It's that like steak. If you have 500 calories of steak, that's more satiating than 500 calories of bread. That like generally carbohydrate is not satiating. That's just the way that it interacts with our hormones. But again, like I hope everyone's appreciating the nuance on it. Where like if you have a big race tomorrow, you should eat a lot of bread today. But if you're trying to lean out, then maybe bias towards a lower calorie diet, and like of those calories, have ones that are more satiating satiating. And yeah, we see people playing Ketone IQ into those types of lean out cycles for sure.
If anyone can sort of have a takeaway from this conversation, we're predominantly talking road cycling here on Life in the Peloton, looking to the classics right now, looking to the Tour de France. These guys, I guess the question is, this performance that we're seeing these teams, is there a sort of a clear way we can see it? Like I sort of had this idea and everyone's sort of asking me, these guys, so-and-so, he's winning so easily now. He must be doping, this guy must be doing that. And you can always go down that rabbit hole, but I'm like, innocent until proven guilty. When it comes to Ketone IQ, are you able now, I guess you're knowing in the back end of what teams are using ketones, what teams aren't. Are you sort of seeing a general idea of when you look at the Peloton now, this separation of these riders that are able to sort of move into the front groups because of this new way of fueling? Do you think it's getting to this point now in the Peloton where you're like, the teams that aren't using it now, it's pretty obvious because they're really just falling off behind when it comes to these longer races, when it comes to these grand tours? Do you think it's getting to the point now where it is becoming such an effect? You talked about a 15%. Do you reckon you can sort of see that now in the Peloton or in different races that where ketones are being really well used?
It's an interesting. I mean, the easy thing for me to say is yes. That the teams that are taking it tend to be pulling ahead. I will also say that the teams that are savvy on ketones are also savvy on other aspects of their training. They're maybe just more forward on other things as well. So I think the easy thing for me to just like pump my own bags is like, yeah, like you got to have ketones to win, and the teams that are having ketones are pulling ahead. And we are seeing that, yes, but I want to be just nuanced in my answer there, which is like the teams that are doing that are also just tend to be more forward on other aspects of their training and more, in favor of change. I think that there's the cultural element of cycling where there's more traditionalists and then there's more forward thinkers, and I don't think either is wrong. I'm obviously more on pro, like moving sport ahead, but I don't necessarily, I think it's more ideological, and I'm not here to say like right or wrong. I think there's some people that think that you just keep it the way it is, keep it the way it always was. Anyway, there's definitely a rabbit hole there. I'm generally pro advancement on the sport, but I will say, to answer the question, we see that the teams that are pro ketones tend to also be pro other edges that are within the rules to try things out, other more like modern training methodologies, other more modern nutrition, other this and that are helping them. So I wish that I could take full credit. Look, ketones are absolutely helping, but I wish I could take full credit. But I think, just to be forthcoming on it, I think that those teams tend to be very, like, you look at what Visma Lease A Bike is doing, like it's more than just ketones. And I think they're just very forward on 4 or 5 other aspects of their game as well.
Michael, it's been bloody great to talk to you, and it's opened my eyes up to, I was already sort of a fan because it sort of helped me out the other day to get through this Equinox ride, but I love the idea of doing a deeper dive into researching about this, even seeing you just sip away on one today in the pod. This idea of, I get up in the morning very early and work, and it'd be nice to sort of start my day with that, knowing that I can have a big morning's worth of work, get a lot of stuff done when my mind is ready for it, and not feel like I need to tap into, some cereal or something like that early in the morning. I love the idea that this can be used in so many facets of casual sport, performance at work, and elite sport. It's very, very cool, and it's very cool to have you on the pod.
Thanks for having me, Mitchell. This is a lot of fun.
Awesome. Okay, now we're going to hear from a pro, the New Zealander George Bennett, a rider who has used ketones to understand what the Peloton really think about using ketones. Well, I'm speaking here with George Bennett. He's in his 13th year as a pro. He's ridden on Radio Shack, Cannondale, Lotto, Jumbo, UAE, and he's now running for Israel Premier Tech. George, always good to chat, mate. Welcome to the pod.
Thanks, Mitch. Great to be here. Great to catch up again. We've just been reminiscing off air for the last 20 minutes, so we should probably click on and do some real recording.
Yeah, well, let's just punch this recording out and then we can just go back to having a chinwag off air. But I want to talk about ketones, and the reason why I want to talk to you about it is because when these sort of started fluffing around in about 2019, 2020, you were on Lotto NL Jumbo, which is now Visma Lease A Bike, and it was a new sort of thing. And we really did see this, well, I felt in the Peloton, this big difference. There was a few teams a step above, a few riders a step above all of a sudden, and there was this whisper in the Peloton, this ketone product. And you were one of the guys, we were starting to use it as well. I didn't really know how to use it. and you were using it as well. I want to ask you what your experience was with it. And when did you first start using ketones?
Well, I remember the whispers, and I reckon the whispers started before then. I reckon the whispers started 2017, because I remember in 2018, Giro getting dropped. Like at the end, I was still up there, but I remember just thinking like, if I had ketones, I'd be able to fly. You know, if I had, because it's built up as these mystery products. Like if I had ketones, that would be the last percent, and I'd be, you know, I wouldn't be eighth, I'd be third. And I think they sort of first came into my sphere of use was 2019. We did use them, and we actually used to use them like, you know, it's funny like how something that a good thing used wrong does more damage than just not using it. It's like a bad massage, you know, you have a bad rub, your legs are cooked. So we basically, when we started using them in 2019, we used to use them in the method of like, with the idea of these things here, an alternative fuel source, and they'll preserve your glycogen. You take them during the race, and then by the end, you'll be fine. You know, right now, in the way we ride bikes, I couldn't think of anything worse than having a ketone on the start line.
Wow. And what's changed the opinion? Because, you know, as you spoke about then, it seemed like it was the golden ticket. It seemed like these riders were on the good path, this secret thing that they were using, or this extra boost of energy. What's changed your opinion now?
Well, I still use ketones. I still think they're a great product in its time and place, but I think that the way racing, I don't know if racing's evolved or it's just that we've come to realize that, in my experience, this is anecdotal, I think, and the power of suggestion here is massive. Some riders started saying like, I couldn't push when I have ketones, because basically I think the idea being that they inhibit, you know, your use of glycogen. It's like people that do low carb diets. There's no way that you'll ever become efficient enough on fat to be able to produce 7 watts a kilo. And I think there's a little bit of similar thought on that when you're trying to go crazy hard at the start of races, and the way races are raced now. You know how some of these tour stages have starts that go for an hour and a half before the break goes, and hardest numbers are in the start. So I started to get the feeling that like, I was like blocked, or I couldn't push, or I felt lethargic with having these ketones. But it is a lot of power suggestion. But that was massively how we used to do it. We used to take ketone before the start, ketone on the start of the first half an hour, second half an hour, and then the idea being you'd stop, and then in the final you've got your full of glycogen stores, and you can punch bigger power.
So you'd be using up to 4 or 5 ketones a day?
You would use 3. We would use 3 ketones a day for my weight, but I'm 58 kilos, you know, so maybe a bigger guy would have done more. But I remember though, one of my best stages, I used ketone all throughout the stage. I did it in the Planche de Belfi, I think when Aru won. Oh, maybe it was the next time we did Planche de Belfi. 2019 Planche de Belfi, Ciccone won, or Dylan's Holmes won. I remember using them and felt great, and did a good stage. So, you know, it's not a blanket rule, but then I started, like I said, power suggestion. I started thinking, oh no, I do feel blocked. And then it just became this thing where I just couldn't use ketones before a race. And so I just stopped.
So what is the feeling like? You know, for everyone out there wondering, you spoke about Planche de Belfi, and you know, I'm sure there's numerous other occasions. I also had this feeling in a Grand Tour, and I'm talking in the long term. I felt better at the end of a Grand Tour over 3 weeks. I felt like I wasn't pushing more numbers, but I was still able to push, let's say 400 or 420 watts on a really hard uphill start that I was doing in the first week of the Grand Tour. I was doing it in the third week. All of a sudden, I felt like I was riding way more forward, but actually I was just, because I was able to push the same numbers, there was a lot more people dropped than, you know, in the first week.
Yeah.
So I had this feeling like, oh my God, it's this secret potion, but actually it just allowed me to not deteriorate over 3 weeks. What's the feeling for you?
Okay. Well, the feeling for me I sometimes get, and I still sometimes get when I take now, is like getting the hunger knock. You know, you get that kind of like low glycogen feel, and you're a bit lethargic, sleepy, and you know that feeling when you just need to get to a servo and have a Coke? It's basically, I kind of had that feeling a little bit. But it's interesting, like on this, you know, because when someone says, oh yeah, they did that to me, and then you hear that and you go, oh yeah, maybe you become very attuned to how that is. And now I think I've used them for a long time, that I actually think I've figured out my niche, and a lot of it, the evidence for how to use, like if they work or not, is like you're saying, it's kind of like a bit subjective. It's a little bit like, well, I'm pushing 400 watts now, but I could always do this. I'm just getting less tired. But it's kind of like anecdotal, and you don't have any hard evidence to back that up. So what I think has changed that a little bit for me is maybe the introduction of, say, like wearables, you know, Oura rings, Whoops, whatever, and you start operating in these other metrics of HRV, heart rate, and things like that. And I did see a couple of interesting things when I took ketones. And one of them also lines up with another anecdotal story that a lot of guys started finding they couldn't take them. Sorry, I should mention at this stage we transitioned from taking them before races and during races to taking them strictly after for recovery as a recovery protocol. And what some guys started finding though is they wouldn't sleep very well. Heart rate would be higher, and they couldn't sleep. And I did notice that when I take ketones with a wearable, my heart rate does go high. But on the other hand, my heart rate variability also goes high, which is a good thing. So, you've got to fine tune when you take them. And I found my little niche of how I take them. And I think, like you, anecdotally, they do help me recovery day to day. They don't give you more power. Your engine's your engine. And basically, you're not changing that. You've got your VO2 max, and what we're dealing with now is just rate of deterioration, stopping your body sort of putting the governor on. And yeah, I mean, for a one-day race for me, I wouldn't take ketones. But for Grand Tours, for a week like Catalonia, the hardest stage race I've ever done last week, I think they were a great thing. And you look at your stats, let's say, from your wearable, and I think that is reflected if I compare it to other races when I don't take ketones. I do think there is an improvement.
How many people do you think are realistically using them in the Peloton? Are you seeing guys reach for their pockets, or are you just hearing around about? Is it a spoken about thing in the Peloton now?
Oh, yeah. And I think it's crazy that I remember in Jumbo, we said, yeah, we use ketones, and we would just be judged. I mean, there's a lot of French teams saying like, this is like doping. And you're like, mate, this is like it's a food product. It's like there's proteins, there's fats, there's carbs, there's ketones, there's alcohol, all different substances that have different calories per gram. It's a food source. Okay, obviously it's manufactured as quite an expensive and processed way to manufacture things, but I didn't see it as a medication. Well, it's not a medication. It's a food supplement. It's a food. So we were open about it, and I don't think there is this. I mean, I don't think people are secretive about it. You see some people hiding finish line, sort of sneaking a bottle and taking it, and then you see other teams chucking it on social media saying like, we're sponsored by these guys. I think there is an element of like, oh well, there hasn't been long-term studies on health, and that's probably a valid concern. But I don't think there's much healthy about crawling through a Grand Tour on your knees either. So people do. I mean, you smell them. There's this distinct smell of ketones, and I still know like one team takes them during a race. I think I might have seen someone in Flanders yesterday going back to the car, getting back and a ketone bottle, and he seemed to go pretty well. I don't know. I think that I saw that. Are
riders at the point now where if their teams aren't paying for them or supplying them, going out and getting them themselves? Is it at that point now where guys are seeing the benefit and just going, you know what, I need to invest in my own career. I believe in ketones. I'm going to pay the money.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a bit of that. But I mean, I don't think it's the thing that like if you're off the pace and you're like, I need ketones to get me back on the pace. It's not, it was, I think the secrecy was the best advertising strategy there ever could have been. You know what I mean? I think like that created this aura of mystique around it that this is the golden bullet and it's hush hush. We don't want anyone to know. And by not wanting anyone to know, I think that people thought, well, it must be bloody good. It must be the difference. And they're good, but they're not the difference. If I could choose between, put it this way, if I could choose between having 100 grams of carbs or a ketone after a Grand Tour stage in preparation for the next day, I'd have 100 grams of carbs any day of the week. But on the other hand, we're dealing in 1%ers. And in a world of 1%ers where I'm worrying about if my socks have lines in them to save me 5 watts, or if in the margins we operate in the difference between the front group, second group, I think I'd buy myself ketones, because I've got one shot at this and I want to do everything I can to be the best.
Have you noticed an effect on your brain function in terms of ketones supporting that, alertness and when you're getting tired and sort of brain fog, having a ketone during a race or post-race is allowing your brain to function and making you sort of a bit more alert?
It's not something I've tuned into. It hasn't been something where like I go, oh shit, I'm on today. I'm alert, I'm sharp. I don't, mate, you get in the bus, let's get in the bus after you've just done 4,000 meters of climbing. You're smashing your recovery food and I basically just pass out in the chair. I don't think that there's any way you could effectively measure alertness without anything more than an anecdotal mention after a stage race. I think there's so many, when you want your evidence to be in the form of peer-reviewed studies and a control group and a variable group, and then you start getting into areas about like alertness, which is not really, it's quite a hard variable to measure. I think you start getting in some areas where, people start chucking on all sorts of claims.
Finally, mate, it's a big question. It sounds like you do believe they work. I guess the question is, do you believe they work?
Yes, but I believe they work in non-traditional ways. And I also believe, so when I say non-traditional ways, not the ways that I originally thought they worked. And I also think there's a whole new area that we're getting into now where it's about blood mass and EPO production and natural EPO production in the body. There's a whole nother area in terms of consistent ketone use and maintain, there's a whole post-altitude block. There's a whole realm that is where they're moving to now. But in general, yes, I do think they work.
Thanks, George. Well, massive episode. A really, really interesting episode. A nice deep dive into what ketones are and how it's affecting the Peloton today. I really would love to hear what you guys think about that. And even if you've gone out and experienced it yourself, it's a new topic and it's sort of on the borderline what people are thinking. But I think as we heard there today, there's nothing in it. This is just another fuel source. It's cool to see the riders tapping into it and pushing the limits. A big thanks goes out to our major partner, MAAP, who are helping us produce the podcast this year, Red Bricks Media, who are putting the podcast together for us, and of course, the Life in the Peloton team. Guys, if you haven't already signed up for the Pelo, a great episode dropped last week chatting about the classics. I want to see you guys across at the Pelo. We've also got a fantastic group chat going on where we're talking all ins and outs about the episodes, chatting about the classics and whatever else is going on at the moment. It's been fun talking to all the members, hearing their opinion on the episode and giving me some great ideas as well. Love hearing from you, so definitely write in and check in with us here at Life in the Peloton. Until next week, guys, cheers. That iconic music in this episode was composed by none other than the legend, Pete Shelley. Cheers, mate.